Alex here grew up in one of those small Ohio communities where everyone knew your coffee order before you entered the cafe. You know the type. Your company becomes everyone's business, whether you like it or not. Rumor moves quicker than the internet. Although I am 28 now, we must first go back to the beginning to truly grasp my narrative. Diane and Robert, my parents, were the conventional small-town power couple, that is, the type you find in movies. Dad was the football captain, Mom was the head cheerleader. Their love story was almost local mythology. They married straight out of high school, and for the first few years of my life, things seemed ideal. Our modest house had a white picket fence, with family pictures covering our walls from birthday celebrations, Christmases by the fireplace, barbecues, and so on. 9 yards overall, but you know how appearances can be misleading. Our family was then living evidence of that. When I first discovered the cracks in our flawless front, I was about 8. It began with arguments, not your usual whose turn is it to do the dishes, but the kind that makes your stomach turn when you're lying in bed at night, trying to block out the sound of raised voices through paper-thin walls. The fights became a nightly ritual, but during the day, my parents would put on this unusual performance. Mom would force a grin when packing my lunch, Dad would nod half-heartedly before leaving for work, and we would all act as though everything was good. But I knew better even then, a small child. Things truly went downhill after Dad lost his job at the plant. I could sense the strain hanging in the air like a storm about to strike. That factory was everything in our community. It drove most people's income and was the backbone of our economy. It was not only my dad who lost his job when it closed, it was as though the town lost its soul. For our family, nevertheless, it was the turning point. Dad struggled greatly, absolutely difficult. He started spending his days on the couch, aimlessly staring at the TV after being this proud provider. He would go for hours without leaving any indication of where he was going, and when he returned, he seemed even more despondent than before. Mom began working extra shifts at the cafe to help pay for things, but that just appeared to sour their relationship. My grandparents then intervened. Living nearby, both sets of them turned into my lifeline. Just outside town, George and Martha, my paternal grandparents, owned a small farm. Grandpa George always had the best stories, while Grandma Martha's baking might make any bad day better. When things were too severe at home, their farm turned into my haven. Then there were Harold and Betty, Mom's parents. Grandpa Harold took great delight in running the modest hardware business in town. Sometimes he would let me assist, showing me how to fix things. Grandma Betty would always bring me along to assist in everything from church bake sales to animal shelter operations. I loathed it at first, but over time, those activities evolved into another haven from the turmoil at home. Looking back, I believe my grandparents understood things weren't right long before anybody else did. They noticed the signals. My parents avoided each other. They hardly noticed my existence, and the gulf separating all of us was widening. But they did their best to protect me from it, to provide some sense of normalcy in the face of all that chaos. I was about 10 when everything eventually collapsed. Mom arrived home following a double shift and discovered Dad asleep on the couch, surrounded by empty bottles. What I had heard previously was not like the screaming match that followed. I recall being still in the hallway watching Mom toss one of the bottles against the wall. Mom packed her bags and headed to live with her parents the next day. The sound of breaking glass seemed to resound through the home, signifying the end of whatever remained of our family. Soon later, the divorce paperwork arrived, and our family formally split apart exactly as that. Fighting over everything from the house to the automobile, even that old battered-up couch, the court fights stretched on what seemed like eternity. Though I bounced between homes like a ping-pong ball through it all, really I spent most of my time with my grandparents. The only others who seemed to recall I existed were accepting Ohio State University seemed like winning the jackpot. All I could think about at 18 was at last getting away from that stifling tiny town and beginning over. To put it mildly, moving was unpleasant. Arriving separately, my parents hardly acknowledged one another while I packed. That was it. Mom gave me this strange side hug, and Dad merely patted my back with a casual, "Good luck, kid." Looking back, I should have spotted the warning signals that something wasn't right. But I was too thrilled about my newly acquired freedom to notice. College turned out to be all I had hoped for and more. On the first day, I met my roommate Tom, and we clicked right away over sci-fi movies and video games. I had a real friend who wasn't mired in all of my family strife for the first time in my life. I finally felt like I was establishing something for myself. Tom grew to be like a brother to me. I attempted to keep in touch with my parents at first, making the required calls every couple of weeks. But our talks felt more like business negotiations than family get-togethers. About it, Mom would inquire if I was keeping up with my academics, Dad would tell me to keep out of trouble, and so on. Not affection, not "we miss you," not real concern in my life. I eventually began to limit the calls to birthdays and holidays, spacing them out. It felt like running through the motions even then. Then came the Facebook post that completely turned my life upside down. Mindlessly browsing my feed during a study break, I came upon it. My mother in a wedding dress standing next to Mark, her 2-year lover. I must have gazed at the screen for a good minute, trying to absorb what I was seeing. Mom had been seeing Mark, but marriage? The caption said, "Just married, excited for our new beginning." And they hadn't even shared with me. I phoned her right away, but it went to voicemail. While my hands were shaking with rage, I texted her, attempting to keep it laid back. Days went by without any reply. Her justification for not inviting me when she eventually got back to me was that they kept the wedding small and private and had forgotten, neglected, like forgetting to get milk at the grocery store, except this was her only child. Just when I thought things couldn't get more weird, 2 weeks later, another wedding picture showed up on my feed. Dad was smiling in a tux next to his 2-year girlfriend Lisa this time. Once more, I had not received invitations. Not heads up, nothing at all. His answer blew me off when I called him to seek an explanation. Laughing, really laughing, he asked, "Alex, who wants their past mistakes showing up at their wedding when they're starting fresh?" A mistake. That is what I meant to show him. Nor his son, nor family, merely a mistake he wanted to overlook. I hung up without saying anything and sat in my dorm room, as though the ground had vanished underfoot. It was not only the weddings, it was the casual cruelty of it all. The way they would have so readily written me out of their life like I was some embarrassing chapter they wanted to delete. Tom discovered me later that night, still seated in the dark. He glanced at me once and sensed something was off, but I couldn't get myself to express everything. How would you explain to someone that your own parents objected to you attending their wedding? Your father labeled you a mistake? Saying it out seemed too sad. The next day, I contacted my grandparents, needing to hear their voices and some link to relatives that truly cared about me. They were exactly as startled about the nuptials as I was, surprising. As it turns out, they had only been invited days before every occasion. When they inquired about me, my parents said I was too busy to go. Another lie to add to the mounting heap. My parents had misled everyone about it, not only excluding me. This struck me strongly. They had developed this story whereby I was too busy, too far away, too whatever to be there on their important days. The truth, though, was simpler and more agonizing. They wanted me nowhere. I fit neither their new lifestyles nor their fresh beginnings. That era was most likely the lowest point in my life. I reminded them of everything they wanted to leave behind. Trying to escape the hurt, I poured myself into my studies. But it was always there, lurking in the rear of my consciousness. On my behalf, my grandparents were enraged. To be honest, their ire allowed me to legitimate my own emotions. At least someone still cared enough to be enraged about how I was being treated. But something else was simmering beneath the surface, something I wouldn't find out about until later, a secret that would explain so much about my parents' behavior and finally change everything. Looking back, the wedding mishaps represented only the top of the iceberg. Still to come, the actual explosion would rock our family to its very foundation. I knew I needed responses following the wedding disaster. About the way my parents behaved, something didn't match up. I stopped tolerating their half-truths and apologies. Not really sure what I was looking for, I traveled back to Ohio, knowing I couldn't just let things alone. George and Martha, my paternal grandparents, picked me up from that small rural airport. Everything seemed different as soon as I got off the jet. Once familiar faded tourist posters and squeaking luggage cars felt like relics from another person's life now. While Grandpa George tried to keep things light with his customary quips, Grandma Martha fretted over me the entire way home, asking if I was eating enough. Walking into their farmhouse seemed like entering a time capsule. We all knew there were difficult conversations ahead. I could sense the strain in the car. The porch swing creaked the same way, and the kitchen still smelled freshly made bread. Everything changed when we sat down at their old kitchen table, the one where I had done homework and eaten innumerable meals. Grandma Martha groaned profoundly and reached for a manila folder from a nearby drawer. Inside that folder was a stack of papers that would turn my world upside down. Loan agreements, signed contracts, receipts. "Alex," she began, "there's something we need you to know. We didn't want you involved, but it's time you know the truth." The truth struck me like a kick to the gut at first. The figures didn't make sense until I saw the words college tuition at the top and my parents' signatures. To pay for my education at Ohio State, my parents borrowed a large sum of money from my grandparents. Hoping it would bring our family closer together, they wanted to be helpful. But in the 6 years following my graduation, my parents had not returned a single dollar. They would have only... And the sum they borrowed was far more than what college ought to have cost. Grabbed it. Used it. Never looked back, Grandpa said, his voice full of feeling. "We wanted to help you, Alex." Grandma nodded, her eyes sadder than I had ever seen them be. "We thought it would be good for you to know your parents had a hand in your education, that they were supporting you. We hoped it might bring you all closer. But your parents haven't made any effort to pay it back." I grew ill. I had assumed during those years that my parents were struggling and saved to cover college expenses. About the weight I must have been bearing on them, I would have felt bad. Still, all of it was a hoax. They had not given anything of sacrifice, like my grandparents had. They had also misled me about it the entire time. When I inquired why they hadn't told me sooner, my grandparents said they hadn't wanted to further sour my already difficult relationship with my parents. Eventually, they thought, my parents would act morally. But following the wedding events and all the lies, they couldn't keep silent anymore. The next day, my parents arrived to the farm unannounced, as if the cosmos had a twisted sense of timing. They have to have heard I returned to town, small-town rumors being just what they are. My stomach contracted as soon as I saw their car come up while out back repairing a fence. We arranged to meet at the neighborhood cafe later that day. Neutral ground and, more importantly, public. This wasn't going to be nice. My dad was staring out the window with his arms folded when we arrived. My mom was fumbling with a napkin, and my parents were already seated in a corner booth. Mom tried to start with niceties, putting on her artificial smile. "It's so good to see you, Alex. We've missed you." The words rang hollow, and I got right to the point. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Dad laughed and offered that same line about having a fresh start, about not wanting to draw past mistakes into it. I inquired about the weddings, about why they'd lied to my grandparents about my being too busy to attend. That word, mistakes, still cuts deeply. Mom claimed they feared I wouldn't want to come since I'd been so distant lately. The hypocrisy was startling. Then I dropped the hint about the college fund. Their faces turned to show colors drained. They began to justify instead of expressing regret. Mom said she had hit hard times, but they would always meant to pay it back. Dad tried to dismiss it totally, saying, "It's just money. I'm sure your grandparents are fine without it." Grandma Martha, who had been silent until then, suddenly spoke up. "It's not just money, Robert," she answered, her voice firm but harsh. Mom's eyes welled up with tears, the same trick she had used countless times before, and she reached for my hand. "It's trust. We trusted you to do right by Alex, and you didn't. You have done nothing except lie and take advantage of us." I retook. I was not finding attraction in it anymore. I knew we were done when Dad grew protective and pounded his fist on the table, rattling the cutlery. Grandpa George got up and said, "That's enough. We're done here. We've given you enough chances, and you've done nothing but take and lie. The next time we meet, we'll be in court." As we left that diner, I could almost feel the eyes of the other patrons on us, could almost hear the gossip machine starting. But I didn't give a damn about what other people thought for the first time in my life. There was no going back. The truth was at last clear. The litigation proceeded more quickly than any of us had anticipated. With all the data we had, Grandpa Harold's attorney friend knew exactly what he was doing and felt we had a strong case. My parents must have finally realized they were in serious trouble since they started calling nonstop, using different numbers since I had blocked their regular ones. Having it all play out felt like seeing a train wreck in slow motion. You know it's going to be bad, but you can't look away. I turned away most of the calls, but one day I noticed a voicemail from my mother. I erased it right away, knowing it was really another ploy for deception. Her voice was trembling, almost desperate. "Alex, please, we need to talk. This lawsuit is ruining everything. We just want to make things right." They did the same thing with my grandparents. Dad phoned them, almost begging. "If this goes through, we'll lose everything. We're already struggling, and if the court rules against us, we're done for." He went on and on about how their new lives were failing because of the case. He never really apologized for what they had done. They were merely sorry they had been found. My grandparents remained firm. They would see us in court if my parents wanted to chat. That, at least directly, shut them off. In a town our size, though, nothing remained silent for very long. People started leaning sides as the rumors went like wildfire. Some people cheered my grandparents as they felt it was about time someone made my parents answerable. Going into town became an exercise in avoiding murmurs and stares. Others, particularly those nearer my parents, accused us of being vengeful and trying to ruin their lives. It took all in me not to turn around and tell them exactly what had truly happened. One day at the grocery store, I overheard someone say, "It's a shame what they're doing to their own son, but I guess that's what happens when money's involved." When the court date finally came, it felt as though the entire town knew about it. Yet, I kept reminding myself that this was about gaining justice for my grandparents, not about what others thought. Early we arrived, ready for battle. When we arrived, though, we discovered my parents slumped outside the courtroom looking very hopeless. Mom had her head in her hands while Dad was fixed on the floor. Their lawyer demanded to meet with us personally just before we were meant to leave, so they hardly looked at us as we passed. He then divulged almost weird things. True rock bottom was reached by my parents. After her manager learned about the case, Mom lost her position at the diner. The real worst thing Dad had to deal with was having to sell his truck, essentially the only item of worth he had left, and working minimum pay just to survive. When they found out about the case and the money they owed, both of their new husbands had left out on them. After both Mark and Lisa sought divorce, my parents had nothing. Their lawyer presented their settlement offer. They would sell their houses and cars to pay back every cent they owed plus interest, therefore avoiding total disaster. They also pledged to write official apologies to my grandparents and me, so acknowledging all they had done. It exceeded our expectations. Listening to their suggestion, I had an odd range of feelings. Part of me was happy since they were at last paying actual penalties for their deeds. Another sensed this unusual melancholy, though. After all, these were my parents. Witnessing them fall apart like this was more difficult than I had imagined. My grandparents and I moved away to talk with our lawyer. My grandparents chose to accept the settlement, even though we had the upper hand and could have pressed for more. I suppose they simply wanted it to be over. They had gone through enough. Dragging things out wouldn't alter the events. This was an opportunity to conclude this chapter and start anew. The next day, my parents turned in their written apologies after signing over their possessions. Reading those letters was almost strange. My dad admitted for the first time how he had failed me as a parent and expressed guilt for calling me a mistake. Mom apologized for all the falsehoods and acknowledged using me as a cover to steal money from my grandparents. Though on paper the words rang hollow, too little, too late. My grandparents, being who they are, asked my parents to lunch following all the signing, a sort of peace offering. We met at the same diner where we had our disagreement, but this time the ambiance was quite different. Shadows of their former selves, my parents appeared broken. Mom reached across the table to grab my hand at one point. The silence between words felt heavy and limitless. We tried small conversation. I drew back automatically, and her eyes clearly showed hurt. "Alex, we really are sorry," she added gently. I nodded but said nothing. We know we messed up, and we're trying to fix it. I simply lost faith in her. It was not that I disagreed she was sorry. Words insufficient to mend what they had broken. Life moved in a new beat following the settlement. When my grandparents at last received their money back, I could sense relief on their faces. It was about justice being done, about right things being corrected, not only about the money. Returning to Chicago, this time I promised myself that I would see my grandparents every other weekend. The weeks after the settlement were unusual. They had shown me what actual family looked like, and I would not take that for granted anymore. Newer scandals and tales eventually replaced the town rumors as they faded. Twice, my parents tried to get in touch, leaving careful voicemails or sending hesitant text messages. I answered sometimes, but stayed far away. Both of them had to downsize drastically following the settlement. I told them I needed time and space to grieve, and that, depending on their behavior, not just their words would determine whether there was ever going to be a chance of restoring our connection. Mom settled into a little apartment on the outskirts of town, while Dad ended up leasing a room from an old buddy from high school. Wanting nothing to do with the catastrophe they had found they had married into, their new mates filed for divorce. For both of them, especially in a town where they had once been known as the golden couple, it was a difficult fall from grace. My grandparents, being the decent people they are, still sometimes check in on my parents. Grandma Martha occasionally gives Mom meals while she's working late at her new job at the gas station. Grandpa George assisted Dad in finding employment using some old farming ties. Tom, my college roommate turned best friend, eventually saw the complete picture. They didn't have to do any of that. Rather, they are wonderful people who naturally care even when others don't deserve it. Through all of this, he had been worried about me. When I opened up to him at last, he merely listened. Just being there. No evaluation, no attempt at correction. It was at this point that I understood family goes beyond just blood. Sometimes it's about the individuals who decide to be at your side during difficult moments. The toughest aspect of all this has been managing the after effects. There are days when I still battle trust problems and find myself wondering about people's motives or waiting for the other shoe to fall. Yes, I began attending therapy. It has helped. Though there have been some good changes as well, it turns out having your parents label you a mistake and steal your education fund can leave some emotional wounds that need expert care to heal. My bond with my grandparents has gotten more solid than it has ever been. These days, we practically speak virtually every day. Those weekend trips have been the highlight of my existence. Grandpa George still has the best stories. Grandma Martha still works to fatten me with her cooking. Last Christmas was the first I spent totally with my grandparents, not even trying to split time with my parents. Grandpa Harold and Grandma Betty have grown even more involved in my life too, always ready with advice or simply a listening ear when I need it. Though odd, it was quite excellent. We watched old movies, baked cookies, and just hung about. There was no conflict, no walking on eggshells, no feigning that everything was good when it wasn't. As regards my parents, it felt real. Well, it's complex. Mom now sends me birthday cards. Dad periodically emails me. I suppose they are trying in their own particular sense. However, even if they are family, I have found that it is okay to keep individuals at distance after they have offended you, perhaps particularly in cases of family. I have lately given forgiving great thought. Though I don't think it's that straightforward, people keep asking me if I have forgiven my parents. I'm not angry anymore, at least not in the raw, searing manner I used to be. However, forgiveness does not imply you have to accept individuals back into your life just as nothing occurred. The whole event has taught me some difficult but worthwhile lessons. Sometimes it just means choosing to go forward without allowing what happened to overtake you. Family isn't always who you're born to. Maybe it's who you choose and who chooses you back. Standing up for what's right isn't always simple, but it's vital, as I have found. Most significantly, I've discovered that it's acceptable to establish limits even with individuals who should love you without conditions. These days, I'm concentrating on constructing my own life. Along with excellent friends and the most encouraging grandparents anyone could wish for, I have a decent career in Chicago. Now, striving for my parents' approval or attempting to make sense of their lies, I am not the fearful child from that small Ohio town. Though not defined by anything, I am my own person formed by all that has transpired. Sometimes I drive past our old house with the picket fence on my way to see my grandparents. It belongs to a young family now, and I have seen them out there having yard play or barbecues. Better memories than the ones I left behind are what I hope they are creating. Regarding me, I'm past due looking back. The narrative of my family might not have a beautiful conclusion, but maybe that's good. I have my own road to take now, and for the first time in my life am truly interested to see where it leads. Still, life seldom neatly bows everything together. What counts is that, surrounded by people really loving me, I am at peace with where I am right now. And ultimately, isn't that what family should ideally be about? Story 2. All right, therefore, this whole thing began when I was 18, and really I still find it difficult to understand. Only 2 years older than me, my stepsister Jade chose to accuse me of something truly terrible, like life-ruining sort of horrible ... I quote M, talking about the kind of thing that might ruin families and cause others to view you like you're trash. Though it's honestly still difficult for me to say, she accused me of attacking her. Not even a little rumor or whatever. She softly informed someone. It was a planned, full-bodied accusation. And the worst aspect is also here ... actually, my parents who reared me, who I felt understood me better than anyone, believed her. Allow me to back up somewhat. From his second marriage, Jade was my dad's stepdaughter. She entered my life roughly 10 years ago. First of all, everything was good. We were young people caught in an odd family mashup, but things changed with our age. Particularly from her dad and her mother. Jade was always somewhat needy, always seeking attention and aid. She was also quite eager to receive it. Since, honestly, I didn't want to be engaged in her drama, I just kind of kept out of it and did my own thing. She battled a lot with her mother, usually with reference to money or education. Though her mother wasn't exactly happy about footing the bill permanently, Jade had all these great ambitions about attending graduate school and doing something amazing. Once they got into a big fight about it. I recall Jade crying when she came over to my mother and complaining she felt abandoned and unsupported. Though my mother consoled her, claiming she understood. Really, I thought it was excessive. Jade S mother wasn't chopping off anything. I sort of agreed since she simply wanted her to start paying her own way. Naturally, though, I kept that view to myself, at least until the day that destroyed everything. Here is therefore the course of that day. Maybe on a visit to friends or at some event, my folks were out. I vaguely recall ... When Jade arrived up at the door looking very furious, I was home by myself. She entered without asking at all, set her luggage down on the floor and collapsed into the couch. She started off anyhow, even though I didn't want to hear whatever conflict she had gone through with her mother this time. It turned out exactly as usual. Her mother was not showing understanding. Nobody thought her blah blah was credible. I tried to be kind and attentive, but this time I simply couldn't keep my tongue under control. I told her, look, perhaps your mom is correct. She has done plenty for you. And perhaps it's time you begin supporting yourself a little if you wish to continue your education. I was as mild as I could have, really, but she didn't appreciate it. She looked at me as though I had denigrated her whole life. I could almost feel her rage pouring off her. She turned around and called me a spoilt brat who didn't know how blessed I was or how difficult it was for her. Which is really ridiculous as we grew up in the same house under the same parents. There was nothing privileged about it. Both of us had only to make do. But since I didn't instantly support her, I suppose in her view, I was the enemy. She then aimed this wild charge at me. She said something like, "You believe you're much better than me, don't you? You are indeed pitiful. And someday everyone will see it." At the time, I dismissed it as she was merely irate and throwing a fit. She should cool off, I advised her. We could discuss it when her emotional level dropped. I then turned from the room. I wasn't going to sit there and let her criticize me for holding a different view. I assumed that was it when she bolted from the house. She would calm off, probably stay enraged for a few days, but finally it would pass. That is simply her natural state. But my mother woke me up the next morning and she seemed quite agitated. She informed me Jade and her mother needed to talk to me. They were downstairs. Though perplexed, I reasoned it had to do with Jade's fight with her mother. I threw on a shirt, then descended downstairs, not even marginally ready for what was ahead. Head in hands, Jade was seated on the couch with her mother's arm about her. Not far away, my parents were standing, looking somewhat stunned. The atmosphere felt tense overall, as though something significant had happened and everyone was waiting for me. Just as I was asking what was going on, Jade started crying and said she cannot believe what I had done to her. My dad looked as though he may pass out, and her mother was looking at me. I asked them to slow down so I could find out what was going on, but Jade insisted on saying how I had crossed a limit and how traumatized she was. She then launched it out there, accusing me of attacking her. Not even sure I could reply. I started to get startled. Before I could defend myself, her mother was on me, screaming that I was a monster and that she couldn't believe I would do anything like this. My mind was racing as I stood there trying to understand what she just said. Dad simply stared at me in the eye after grabbing me by the shoulders. I could see the uncertainty, the resentment, and it broke something inside of me. He advised me to own what I had done and provide an apology. Admit something I never even done. I began to explain that nothing occurred, that Jade was lying but no one was listening. Then, in the middle of my parents and her mother panicking, I lost it. Really, quite enraged. Not thinking, I grabbed a nearby vase and banged it against the wall to silence everyone from yelling. It attracted their attention, but not in a positive light. Saying I was acting aggressively, my dad instantly pushed me back and instructed me to head to my room. Locked in my room for hours, pacing, furious, and trying to decide what to do, I finally found myself. How could people simply believe her without second thought? I never did anything to cause them to distrust me prior. Though I didn't know Jade's perspective, I knew she was lying. I simply didn't know why she would go to such extremes. That day stretched the longest of my life. I stayed in that room till my dad entered and informed me Jade and her mother had left. I knew, though, this was not done. The way he looked told it all. He believed I was guilty, that his son was a sort of monster. He shut me down when I tried to explain once again, claiming he wanted no more lies. And my world began to fall apart right like that terrible accusation the next day. Things descended more quickly than I could have imagined, even conceivable. I reasoned that perhaps my folks would cool off and allow me time to adequately explain things. I reasoned they would at least sit down with me and help me sort things out. But that was simply my foolishly hopeful attitude. Any possibility for morning reasoning with them was lost. That night I hardly slept. I stayed staring at my ceiling, going over every small event again. I kept wondering whether perhaps this was all a horrible dream, and that I would wake up to find things back as usual. Not so, though. My dad arrived in my room early the following morning and looked somewhat gravely, almost dissatisfied. He hardly looked at me. He instructed me to come downstairs and that Jade and her mother would settle things right now. The scene was exactly as previously. Jade on the couch, staring broken. Her mother was next to her, and my parents were clearly devastated. I wished I could scream. It was like entering some sort of intervention. But I was the one under attack, this villain they all had to deal with before I even sat down. My dad started this talk on how Jade was feeling unsafe and how she could not be near me anymore. They seemed to have chosen a course of action without even allowing me to voice opinions. Then he let it fall. I was being sent off. Thinking he was not serious, I chuckled. "You're kicking me out over a lie, really?" Trying to keep my voice under control, I inquired, but he didn't reply. Just stared at me with this icy demeanor, as though he didn't even know who I was now. Though she didn't say anything in my defense, my mother turned aside, and I could tell she was crying. Starting to beg, I said I didn't do anything and that Jade was fabricating this, but it was like talking to a wall. Jade was sitting there staring at me with these depressed little looks as if she were some sort of victim. Her mother was caressing her back and murmuring that things would be all right. At last, my dad cut me off and advised me that my disappearance for a little would be the only way they might prevent more shame. They previously agreed with Jade and her mother that they wouldn't go to the police should I leave town. That's the bargain. Vanishes. I wondered. Where ought I to be going? It was during this time they mentioned my Aunt Dot. My aunt was not precisely the friendly, inviting kind now. Our family knew her as the austere one, and if they didn't have to, nobody ever hung about with her. She essentially lived alone in this peaceful small town a few hours away. Though I hardly knew her and hadn't seen her in years, allegedly that would be where I would be secure to prevent Jade from seeing me and experiencing her pain. I went crazy when I knew they were dead serious. I warned them I wouldn't allow them toss me off to some arbitrary relative like I was garbage. Real chilly, my dad replied, looking at me. You have no choice. He dropped the last grenade on me then. Part of the deal, they were also giving Jade my college fund Dot that eluded me even in processing. All the money my parents had accumulated for my future, my education fund. Just pass it to her to help her remain silent. With everything I had worked toward, it felt like they were paying her off with my life. I simply stood there stunned while they all spoke around me as though I wasn't even there, Dot. Eventually, I simply stopped chatting. I don't even know how long I stood there before I understood my dad was essentially waiting for me to pack up and go. No room for compromise, no conversation. That was all they wanted. That I be gone. My mother seemed like she wanted to say something, but every time I looked at her, she simply turned away Dot, like she could not manage facing me with nothing to say. I walked upstairs and got to work packing. I seemed to be gliding across water. My memory is empty. I packed clothes, some books, and a few items dear to me. I had no idea if I would even be let back or how long I would be gone. I therefore took everything I would have wanted if I were leaving permanently, Dot. Though I could not make out what my parents were saying, I could hear their faint voices below. I momentarily considered perhaps they would come up. Perhaps they would come to see how ridiculous this all was and have a change of opinion. Still, they did not. Nobody showed up. They knocked on my door many hours later and said it was time to leave, Dot. My aunt had promised to look after me, and they had already given her a call informing her I was en route. They let me say farewell to no one at all. Saying that disappearing meant no interaction with anyone from my life here, they grabbed my phone. How I was going to inform my pals eluded me. Just explain why I disappeared. Dot. It made no difference to them. They instructed me to be ready in half an hour and pack whatever else I might need. I had never felt in my life such captivity and powerlessness. Carrying my belongings, I left the house and could sense my dad watching me from the doorway, as though he were verifying my genuine departure. Not even willing to see me off, my mother was inside somewhere. Jade and her mother had already left, and I recall having this weird sense of emptiness like my entire life had been deleted in one day. The vehicle trip to my aunt's was quiet and drawn out. My dad drove and spoke hardly at all the whole time. I believe I asked him once, maybe twice, whether he truly believed Jade over me, but he simply tightened his hold on the wheel and turned away from me. My thoughts were in turmoil. I watched out the window and kept wondering what I was meant to do. Currently, without help or a strategy, how could I start from nothing? When we at last arrived at my aunt's house, it felt like being dropped off at a jail. Her apartment felt so lonely. It was little, rather run down with this ancient fence around it. Now I was meant to live in exile after not seeing her in years, all thanks to a falsehood. My dad left me to handle my things alone, not even strolled me to the door. "We're doing this for your own benefit," he continued, and left standing there, watching him head out without turning around. I could feel this great wrath boiling inside of me. Like some criminal, my own family, the people meant to have my back had tossed me away. For what then? In order to keep Jade content, to avoid embarrassing oneself. Though I wanted to yell, cry, or punch anything, I held back. I simply stood there, clutching my things and feeling absolutely alone. Right then. This was my life, cut off from every person I have ever known, all from a lie I was unable to counter. I stood at my aunt's door, knocking. She also lacked even a grin as she opened it. Just instructed me to come in after looking at me both up and down. And that's how I came up here in the middle of nowhere, sitting like a weight in my chest, betrayed by my family, and with just a few suitcases. The worst sensation in the world, and I had no idea if it would ever get any better. Living with my aunt was difficult. She never definitely wanted me there, in my opinion. She did not state it straightforwardly, but she had to. The second I entered the door, she gave me a tight-lipped glance and pointed down the corridor to this small room barely fit for a bed and a dresser. She murmured something about how she was doing my parents a favor and that I should behave myself. Perfect. Hi, certainly. Not exactly mean, though, was my aunt. Just frigid. She didn't like any kind of departure from her own rigorous approach to accomplishing things. Supper at 6 o'clock. Sharp. Not a single sound after 9. No visitors ever. I cannot even use several refrigerator shelves, the thermostat, or touch the TV. She had this entire system, and God help me, should I inadvertently tamper with it? To be honest, it felt like living in a cage, and it was not nearly the worst aspect. It was very terrible to be alone. Living in this small village, almost in the middle of nowhere, my aunt was few stores, no social scene, just a few petrol stations and some fast food restaurants. I knew no one, and I wasn't exactly free to stay in touch with those from my former life. That was abundantly evident from my parents. They had taken my phone, so I had nothing. No emails, no numbers. At first, I simply sulked around two offended and damaged people trying to be useful. Spending most of my days staring out the window, I felt bad about myself and kept running over everything in my thoughts, trying to find where it all went wrong. I mean, I was furious, like deep down wrath developing in my stomach, sort of irate. Though I wanted to yell at my parents, Jade, and everyone else who had turned their backs on me, I was powerless. Trying to decide what the hell to do next, I was caught in this strange limbo. But a few weeks later, I knew I had to leave the house, if only to prevent myself from spiraling crazy. It was really evident from my aunt that she had no desire to support me beyond just providing a house. She would make tiny remarks about responsibility and pulling my weight and leave employment pamphlets for around the house laying about. She seemed to be trying to make it so unpleasant that I would just get the signal and leave. I thus made the only decision I could: get a job and begin to save to go. Given no college fund and no contacts out here, I had few choices. I applied at several companies, especially in retail and food service, but nothing turned up until I found employment as a warehouse worker. Though not glitzy, it was something. The employment was hard. Hours long, I returned home barely able to raise my arms, coated in dirt and sweat. I stayed with it nevertheless, as it provided a purpose for me to leave my aunt's house every day and included some cash in my pocket. The best thing about it is I was not by myself in suffering. I got to know other colleagues around my age who were working through personal problems. Derek, one of the guys, was working double shifts to pay off some debt. Then there was James, who recently arrived in town to flee a family situation that seemed nearly as disorganized as mine. We bonded very rapidly since we were all broke, hardworking, and bored. A few months later, we developed a strategy. We would pool our funds, locate a reasonably priced apartment, and leave our deplorable living conditions. I was totally in. Anything improved over living with my aunt, so we worked for weeks gathering every dollar we could. To save, eat nothing except dollar store snacks and ramen. At last, we came upon a rundown small flat just barely large enough for the three of us. But that was our. Moving out was like reclaiming my freedom, if only in little measure. Though we didn't give a damn about the location. A dump. Our secondhand couch was probably older than all of us combined. An inexpensive table and some mismatched seats. Not much, but for the first time in years, I felt as though I could breathe once more. Naturally, things were not quite flawless sailing. Living on your own during financial difficulty is a grind. Most of the time, we seldom saw each other. We all worked lengthy shifts, alternately night and day employment. But the times when we were all home at once, sprawled on the couch, sharing a cheap pizza or grumbling about our terrible jobs, made the trip worthwhile. We would rave about our families, our companies, and everything else that was screwing us over. It resembled our own little gang of therapists. A few more months later, I began to see I could indeed create a life here. Though it was nothing like the life I had intended for myself, it was something. At the warehouse, I was elevated to a supervisor post, which meant a little more but not very much. With that extra money, though, I began saving for items I had been lacking, like a decent phone. Once I had one again, I thought about contacting folks from my former life. But I kept second-guessing. Though another part of me was still too furious and heartbroken to even begin those talks, part of me wanted to reconnect, to tell everyone the truth. Rather, I gave my new life top priority. Just putting my toe back into the whole schooling scene, I registered for a few evening courses at the neighborhood community college. It was something, not the degree I had in mind or the dream university. It also provided me a motivation to stay on, to keep saving and attempting to create a life that was really mine, not something my family's problems pushed into. Though I discovered little moments of pleasure here and there, life was not easy. Derek and James grew more like brothers than roommates, and we supported one another through difficult times. Should one of us have a bad day, the other two would bring inexpensive beverages or munchies. Well, not for me since I'm off that. We would gather around discussing the future, attempting to picture a life not only daily survival. We seemed to need one another to keep on, to keep in mind something better was just waiting for us. Sometimes I would catch myself still resentful, still thinking about Jade and my family, and wondering how they could have simply thrown me away like that. At least temporarily, though, I was at last learning how to ignore those ideas. Now I had my own existence, a small bubble of individuals who truly loved me and treated me differently than a criminal. I felt maybe, just maybe, I would make it through for the first time since all this started. At last, things felt under control. Though I had my own schedule, a few close friends, and I was even somewhat improving in my work and classes, life was not great. Though I wasn't exactly happy, I was surviving, and it was a hell of a lot more than I would have believed I would be doing a year earlier. One Tuesday night at random, while I was returning from work, my phone buzzed with an email alert. Though something told me to check, I almost disregarded it. It came from my father. Since they dumped me at my aunt's place, my family hadn't spoken once. Telling myself I was better off without them, I attempted to ignore them from my mind. But seeing that email hit me like a gut strike. Standing there staring at the computer, I questioned if I ought to even open it. Part of me wanted to pretend as though they didn't exist, delete it right away. But I clicked on curiosity as it won out. The little message was really short. According to my dad, there had been some fresh developments, and he wanted to reconnect. He said Jade had at last gone clean about what had happened. As such. Like it was some little detail. Unlike she hadn't turned my entire existence upside down. My brain was trying to organize it. Jade had come clean about lying. The narrative opened up as I continued reading. Apparently her boyfriend, someone I knew nothing about or cared about, recorded her discussing the entire incident. I'm not sure whether she'd been chatting with one of her friends or perhaps him. Still, the key was that she acknowledged she made everything up. She claimed she wanted to teach me a lesson, so she did it, that he deserved it after I had corrected her that day. The whole situation had spun out of control more quickly than she could have imagined. She couldn't back down either by the time she knew how far it had gone. The worst thing about it is that he was almost excusing it. My dad's email tone seemed to be, "She was sorry," he said, but she was handling personal problems and didn't understand the effect. I staggered. Really, she had no idea the impact. She took my whole life, wrecked everything, and they were behaving as though it were just some small error. And her parents, the ones meant to know me better than anyone, had believed her. Absolutely, without a doubt. Saying he wanted to catch up and that he hoped I would understand and proceed as if he hadn't abandoned me, my dad ended the email. The second thing got difficult, as if they hadn't driven me into exile and deprived me of everything. By the time I got through reading, I was shivering with rage. I ignored her. Not possible. I sat there, allowing the truth of it all to sink in. When Derek and James returned home, they observed something was strange. I first brushed aside their inquiries about if I was okay. Before I could even begin to explain, I had to calm myself as I was too agitated and work-driven. I hardly slept that night. The whole incident kept running over in my head. Every time I begged my parents, every time they looked at me as though I were a monster. All of it came flying back, this time adding yet another degree of treachery. I told Derek and James all the next morning. I started with the accusation, the desertion, all the garbage with my aunt, the warehouse job, and, lastly, the email from my dad. Their faces changed from amazement to rage as I went over what Jade had done and how my family had treated me. They listened without interrupting. She just confessed it since Derek shook his head, appearing like he wanted to strike something after I finished. And right now, they're behaving as though you should simply forget it ever happened. I answered, trying not to let my voice waver, likewise, like it was no great deal. James fixed me a serious glance. You ought to inform all of them. People have to be informed of the truth. You have been evading, Guy. Even after they cut you off, you have let them run your life. He was right, as I knew. Fearful of what my family may think, I had been living in the shadows, continuously peering over my shoulder, reluctant to even contact old friends. Even from far away, I had been allowing them control over my life. But considering addressing everyone and trying to explain what occurred, it was quite horrible. Still, a strategy began to take shape while I sat there with Derek and James. Later that week, I wrote a reply to his email. I kept it brief, just sufficient to let him know I was done serving as their scapegoat. I told him I wasn't interested in moving ahead unless it meant telling everyone the truth. I needed my family to own their actions toward me. Though I was still too offended to enjoy it, I pushed submit and felt this odd mix of relief and wrath, like I would have finally broken free. 2 days later, I received yet another email, this one from my mother. She was begging me, arguing that I didn't have to go public and that family concerns belong inside the family. She implored me to consider Jade and her delicate condition. It was absurd. She was still having her sentiments subordinated to all else. I showed the email to Derek and James, even knowing the truth, and they essentially urged me to go forward with clearing my name so I could recover the life Jade had taken that evening. For the first time in years, I signed on to social media. I had turned away from it, afraid about what others would think, haunted by all the lies they most likely accepted. Still, this time I was not hiding. I left a lengthy message covering all from beginning to end. About Jade's allegations, I spoke the truth, the aftermath for my parents. I didn't hold back when I was moved to live with my aunt and all the difficulties I had experienced since then. People wanted to know what I had gone through. The betrayal, the loneliness. They helped me to realize that I was not the monster my family had created. My heart thumping, I sat there staring at the screen once I pushed submit. I was momentarily regretful about it, questioning whether I had made a major error. Then, though, the response began to flow. Messages from far-off relatives, former friends, even someone I hardly knew, all stretching out in shock and encouragement. On my behalf, people were furious, horrified at what Jade had done and how my family had treated me. Though it was overpowering, it felt as though a weight had at once offloaded from my shoulders. The support never stopped. In the next days, people were seeing the truth, and at last hearing my perspective. And I thought I could breathe for the first time in years. I was not concealing anymore. The days following the truth's publication were a mix of anarchy and relief. Notifications from old friends, relatives, and even some acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years exploded on my phone. People startled each other. Outraged, helping, bewildered. It was all over the board. Still, it felt nice, like others were seeing my side for the first time in a very long period. I felt neither drowning in a lie nor as though I was. Some of the responses came from relatives who had sensed something was strange, but hadn't put it all together until they came onto my post. A few said they were sorry they hadn't gotten in touch sooner, and that they had accepted whatever narrative my parents had offered them. Some relatives even claimed they had been advised I had moved away to clear my head following some personal crises. My indignation only intensified, knowing how much they had lied only to silence me and make themselves look good. The cover-up had been far more than I had realized. There then was the other side of it. Furious were my parents and Jade's mother. They emailed me saying I had destroyed Jade's life and betrayed the family. They claimed I was being harsh for pulling up past problems solely to harm everyone, and even suggested I was doing this when Jade was fighting. To be honest, reading their texts hardly bothered me anymore. Over and over, it was the same stuff. then putting Jade's emotions first over all else. They couldn't understand how ridiculous they sounded supporting her when she had practically lied to destroy my life. They were so ignorant of the damage she had done. I choose to block them all. I turned around. Every opportunity I had to have them come clean, own their mistakes, and instead they doubled down. At last, I was in charge of my life, free from their continual meddling or sense of guilt for some part of everything. Jade's life rapidly fell after all came out. Her support from others has faded. Everyone in our area knew she had lied about something major only to ruin my life and get her way once the truth started to circulate. Word got to her not too long ago. Friends, educators, former classmates, everyone turned away from her. People began handling her as though she were radioactive. To be honest, I can't say she was deserving. Mother of Jade was utterly appalled. She believed every word in her daughter's account from the beginning, and suddenly the entire village was viewing her as if she had produced some sort of monster. She eventually could not bear the guilt or the fallout. People were telling her straight out they had no interest in her, as long as Jade was in view. Her mom tried to smooth things over with apologies here and there, but it didn't matter. The harm was done. People grew disgusted. It grew worse the more people learned. At last, Jade's mother disowned her after she had her breaking moment. It seemed to me a combination of guilt and bitterness. She most likely felt used to her own daughter pulling her into this mess, so she looked like an enabler to something so horrible. Coming back from that is not simple. Jade arrived with no one in her corner. Her mother even kicked her out of the house, I had heard. She was essentially alone, caught trying to deal with the consequences of her own conduct, and no one wanted to support her. With everyone in town avoiding her and her own mother severing relations, Jade had to leave without an option. Initially, assuming things would blow over, she tried to hang about, but folks wouldn't let it go. She would get stares, whispers, and folks chatting behind her back everywhere she went. She tried to make apologies to others, but they turned her away. She clearly could not stay, not if she wanted any chance of a life free from continual judgment and isolation. Jade packed finally and left town. I'm not sure her destination was. To be honest, I'm not particularly interested. She opted to wreck my life instead after getting her shot. She is now the one facing fallout from her lies. And based on what I have heard, she is totally alone, finally behind me all of that. I became concentrated on the life I had created here. Through it all, Derek and James kept me grounded and reminded me that I wasn't alone. It was odd after years of feeling alone, but consoling to know I had friends in my life. We had gone through so much in that horrible tiny apartment, and now that things were calm, I felt more near to them than ever. I began corresponding with some people from my former life who had contacted me following my post about that period. A few of them had relocated to a nearby city and asked me to pay a weekend visit. First, it seemed strange, like re-entering a life I had left behind. Still, it felt fantastic as well. Inquiring about my work, my classes, and the people I had made, they were actually curious about what I had been doing. There was no awkwardness or pity calls. They just appeared content to have me back off. That weekend helped me to really see how much I had lost from a regular social life. People who knew me from before everything collapsed. It seemed like a piece of myself I had forgotten I had dropped was at last finding her way back. The finest thing was that I could at last be really honest about everything. Gone are secrets. Hide no more. The true tale was heard by my buddies, not the one my family had twisted and distributed around. Story 3. All right, so here's the thing. It was not meant to be anything very serious. Thomas, my husband, and I have been living 7 years together. 5 years married. Ethan is 5 years old and a small man. I suppose family life was usual. The type of normal in which you seldom pause to consider it since it simply flows automatically. Thomas is a builder by trade. Strong work, nice. Right now, pay the complete deal. I am employed in marketing for a small technology company. Not flashy, but it covers the expenses. Life was regular. I would head to while he left to go to his office. At the end of the day, we would get together back home. Tag team dinner, wash Ethan, then get him into bed. We would then be in bed ourselves. It was good. Alternatively, at least I thought it was. But Thomas received a major promotion at his place 5 months ago, and to be honest, I was delighted for him. Actually, I am. He had been hunting for this. Most likely among his main aspirations throughout his career. Longer hours and additional responsibility accompanied that, though he was almost living in the office suddenly. After a little, I reasoned it would calm down. Perhaps he was merely attempting to establish himself in the new position, but no such. In fact, it grew worse. Thinking that we might have some time together when he got home, I would wait for him. Unfortunately, he would just drag himself in, barely managing a high before collapsing on the couch. He would occasionally fail even to get to bed. Still in his work attire, like some sort of overworked robot, he would simply crash right there in the living room. At first I thought, okay, it's only a temporary slump. He will bounce back from it. This is the period of adjustment. Still, weeks went by, then months. And the truth is, if you understand what I mean, I was lacking not only his attention. I would try starting things in the bedroom, and he would simply murmur something like, "I'm extremely sleepy," with a half-conscious face, presumably tomorrow. Skipper, not tomorrow. So yes, I started to feel fairly excluded, and on the emotional level as well as physically. He seemed as though he no longer saw me. Like I was simply a part of the schedule he had to deal with outside of the office. That truly began to screw with my head. I was simply waiting for some sort of non-verbal communication lacking. What to do eluded me. And the more I considered it, the more agitated I grew. About this time, I also started working intensely. We were trying to land this large customer. Simon owned a little financial consulting business. For us, he was a significant deal, as, should we get him to sign with us, things would have changed dramatically. Like a corporate-wide kind of agreement. I was thus under a lot of pressure to bring it off. Ever the king of evasive encouragement, my supervisor advised me to treat Simon especially holistically. She even advised me to be a little nicer, more intimate, to foster his confidence. Not stating I should go by any rules, but, be friendly. That is business language for doing whatever it takes without formally violating any policies. I so began spending more time with Simon, attempting to give him value. Showing him our organization was not simply another faceless, cold entity. Lunches, coffee breaks, and protracted talks about his requirements and what we might do for him. Everything is said here. I was acting according to advice, and I suppose all the work kept me quite preoccupied as well. The odd thing is that Simon was very pleasant to be around. He is 48, separated, and without children. Not exactly what I would describe as my type, but he was pleasant to chat with and had a laid-back attitude, usually cracking jokes and lighthearted mocking of events. When opposed to the silence I was experiencing at home, this seemed like a great comfort. We would go for these meals, and he would ask about my day and pay attention to me rant about tiny things. He appeared to be genuinely interested. One lunch in particular comes to me clearly. I recall having one of those crazy days. Ethan had been a troublemaker that morning. Work was just unrelenting. And then I splashed water all over my restaurant shirt. Just my chance. I dismissed it, but when I looked back, Simon was staring at me in another manner. Not like he was being eerie, but I could certainly sense something in his gaze. Though the expression made me excited in months not seen, I realize it sounds pitiful. Here was someone genuinely seeing me, really gazing at me. At first, I dismissed it, telling myself I was seeing things and that he was just being polite. But I couldn't ignore that it made me feel something, a spark I hadn't felt in what seemed like eternity. Our talks then turned somewhat more intimate. Nothing bizarre, just him inquiring about my life, how things were going at home, that sort of thing. I wasn't going to open myself, but Simon would nod, listen, and give me sympathetic looks as I dropped hints here and there about how things weren't perfect between Thomas and me. I suppose part of me enjoyed that he noticed we started having more lunches together, sometimes dinners when it was convenient. I think he picked up on my loneliness fairly fast. And really, I began to look forward to these small getaways. Oh, I get to see Simon today. I would leave the office thinking. It was simply convenient. I was loving the attention, even though I didn't have to act as though everything was good or pleasant. Though I'm not proud to say it, knowing someone wanted to hear about my day and truly cared made me feel good. She said I looked well. In a long period, I hadn't felt that, and it was like this irresistible tiny sensation I was deprived of. Looking back, I can see it began to go from simply business to something more. I didn't want to confess it, though. At the moment, I reminded myself I was merely doing my job and that I was being friendly. Deep down, though, I believe I realized I was stretching a limit, even if it wasn't physical. We weren't doing anything illegal, hence I was playing with fire and persuaded myself it was innocuous. That's how I suppose it begins for everyone. Though the border just keeps shifting, you believe everything is benign. I wish I could say I quit right then. Though I wish I could say I stepped back and refocused my marriage, or at least had a difficult conversation with Thomas about how I felt. I did not. I let the spark with Simon flourish and allowed the pleasure to draw me in, since for once I felt observed. Yeah, the line I told myself I would never cross. I crossed it, and frankly I couldn't see it approaching, which when considering it now seems foolish. Still, it just sort of occurred. Another one of those lunch sessions with Simon. If I were honest, by now we had seen many times more than I needed. But the agreement was no longer the focus. I hadn't felt that in a while. It had become something I looked forward to, something that genuinely made me feel wonderful. That day comes quite clearly to me. Having tried to chat with Thomas the evening before, I was very depressed. About us, and he was simply zoned out the entire time. I even inquired whether he still thought me beautiful. He stared at me as if I had asked him what 2 + 2 was, then murmured something about tiredness. It made me collapse. Like, how would you characterize that kind of emptiness? Anyway, I was bringing that with me when I visited Simon. Frustrated, I suppose I sought some kind of confirmation. I was thus seated across from him, somewhat venting. Not specifically regarding Thomas, but near enough. He is just listening as well. He was not zoning out or speaking while fixed on his phone. He was there, totally absorbed, giggling at my small jokes, nodding when I was irritated about business affairs, simply being there, and it felt great. I once tipped over a glass of water on the table. Simon laughed, stating that day had to be among those rare ones, then stretched out to assist me with the napkins. I froze while his hand brushed mine. It was absolutely nothing. Surely innocent, but I couldn't help but notice. I felt my face heat up, and I believe he sensed it too as his smile softened in an almost purposeful manner. Then he remarked, it's great to chat with someone who really pays attention. I said nothing. I only nodded and felt my tummy flip in a strange manner. That instant changed the complete environment we were surrounded with. Like all the background noise vanished, I suddenly became aware of him, his eyes fixed on me, and the silence between us. That felt much too strong for a public venue. I knew I should have left right then, or at least modified the topic to something absolutely business, but I did not. Rather, we kept talking. It was as if the line separating just business from something else began to dissolve more and more every time he chuckled at something I said. I wanted it to continue since I felt this tiny thrill, like he was providing exactly what I had been missing at home. We strolled out together after lunch, and there was that embarrassing moment when we were both sort of lingering in the parking lot. Usually we say, "See you later," and head our different directions. This time I'm not sure. Neither of us did. We stood there just now. This strange suspense is developing between us. Simon looked at me at last and asked, "Do you want to come over for coffee?" Precisely like that. I hesitated, considering every justification I ought to offer to turn down. I knew really what that meant. Coffee was only the cover, but instead of citing all the grounds to say no, I could only think of not wanting to return home to an empty house, to the same quiet causing months of insanity. I answered yes, in line with this. I hardly remembered the trip to his house. I kept telling myself I was simply heading over for a cup of coffee, and that I could leave any moment I wanted, as my hands shook on the wheel. Deep down, though I believe I was acting just as I should have. Once we arrived at his house, everything seemed bizarre, like me observing all of this from outside myself. He handed me a coffee cup. We talked while seated on the couch, but it was no more laid back. Every word seemed weighted. like we were both saying. That which we did not mean dot, like we were just playing along until we stopped playing. He moved just a little bit at some point, but enough to feel his arm touch mine. I turned to check, and before I knew it, he was kissing me. I did not withdraw. I stopped him not once either. I simply let it happen. Because at that instant it felt as though every irritation, every sense of unseen neglect, all of it simply slipped away. We ended up in his bedroom, not a wild, crazy scene like in movies or anything. It was slower, as we were both still figuring it out. And I recall experiencing a mixture of guilt and exhilaration, knowing what I was doing was wrong, but I didn't care enough to stop. All I could think was how alive I felt at that very moment. Like someone really saw me for the first time in eternity. Reality arrived like a goods train when it was over. I laid there fixed on the ceiling. This terrible sinking sensation developed in my gut. What have I done? I wondered constantly. But concurrently, I wanted not to return to that empty house, to that silence and that persistent sense of invisibility. I realized I had gone beyond what I could undo, and part of me was already counting down the days. Still, another part of me was relieved. I got up and tried to dress as quietly as I might. Simon was half asleep, and I wouldn't want to wake him. I simply needed to get out of there, clear my thoughts, and work out what the hell I was going to do next. I checked my phone as I slid out the door. 2 Thomas missed calls. My chest dropped. Trying to find a justification, my head went crazy. Some justification for my silence in responding. The drive home passed as one haze. I kept practicing my response should Thomas ask me where I had gone. Hands shaking on the steering wheel. Expecting him to be standing there demanding responses, I felt like I was going into a trap by the time I arrived home. But he wasn't. Just as usual, he was asleep, fully blind. I shut the door, headed straight to the bathroom, and peered back in the mirror. I dressed differently. Alternatively, I might have simply felt different. Trying to clear the guilt already chewing at me, I splashed water on my face. But water was not going to undo what I had done. I had gone across the line and there was no turning back. That evening, lying in bed, I kept telling myself it was only one-time occurrence. Just a simple, careless error driven by impulse. Still, I realized I was lying to myself deep beyond my consciousness. I knew Simon would be back in a few days. That evening with Simon was a blur. It was like I was divided in two. I tried to get back to normal, refocus on work, on my son, on being the wife I had assumed I would be this whole time. One side of me yearned to forget the evening ever happened, while the other kept running over every tiny detail in my memory like it were the best secret I would have ever had. I kept reminding myself that this was a one-time event, just one simple, careless mistake. Still, Simon kept running across in my mind. Half hoping he would text, half praying he wouldn't, I would glance at my phone. One day, just about noon, I also received a note from him. "Once more coffee? Just 2 words. I looked at my phone and felt my heart pounding in a way that was really absurd for a coffee invitation. Still, there was exhilaration. Like I was 18 once more or something. Certainly before I could persuade myself out of it. We got together in a little location on the opposite side of town, where I knew I wouldn't run across anyone I knew. I came in second and found him seated there, grinning at me. That guilt I had been juggling stopped. I suppose I simply wanted to be desired. And seated across from him, I sensed that invisible aspect of me returning to life at home. At first, we kept things light, just chatting about arbitrary topics. The nature of labor was changing. His handling of his own customers was interesting, but I could see that we were both dodging what had happened between us. Though we were not saying anything about it, there was a tension in the air that felt as though it were dragging us together. At last, he turned to face me and asked, "Do you regret it? That night?" I stared down my coffee, whirling it aimlessly as I had no idea what to say. One part of me wanted to say yes, I did regret it. Still, the reality is, as it happened, I did not. Not wholly. Though I felt terrible, clearly, the way he treated me made me feel like I was worth noticing. I found myself unable to say I wish it hadn't happened. Not sure. Half expecting he would simply let it drop, I said at last, but he did not. Rather, He stretched across the table and gently rested his palm on mine, smack in the middle of a packed coffee shop. I recall looking about, afraid someone would see us, but nobody was looking. It felt as though we were invisible. Two people who had been disregarded for so long hardly gave a damn who noticed now. For a minute we sat there, both of us acting as though this was quite natural while holding hands across the table. Like the small moment we were pilfering was not illegal. Then he bent in and said, "Let's go somewhere else." I ought to have denied it, though I should have left right away, and there I did not. I trailed him out of the cafe and found us back at his house, including all that followed as well. Emotions were all mixed together. It was both fantastic and horrible at once, and I realized right then that I had let myself tumble down a hole. I couldn't get out of it. Later that evening, when I arrived home, I felt as though I was dragging a weight on my shoulders from which I couldn't seem to release. I wanted to feel something as I walked inside the house and saw Thomas. Some kind of link, some warmth. But the place was simply quiet when I arrived. Not even looking up as I came by, Thomas was seated on the couch surfing through his phone. I went to strike up a discussion with him, anything to grab his attention, to undo whatever I had begun. I inquired about his new project's progress and his working situation. Anybody? Sure, he said, but his answers were brief and unfocused, as if he was hardly noticing that I was there. I couldn't help but wonder if he would rather be back at the office handling clients or designing layouts than seated here chatting to me. And then I was alone in my own house, struck with this chilly, heavy awareness. This was beyond his level of tiredness or busyness. We had ceased to be a team somewhere along the road. We would live under the same roof and go about our separate lives, just running through the motions without even noticing it. That evening I went to bed feeling this strange mix of shame and wrath at his seeming apathy. Guilty, as I was focusing on someone else while doing precisely what I detested about him. Every time I closed my eyes, though, I kept picturing Simon's face. I kept hearing him say I was valuable, and that was like a lifeline, not able to let go of. A few days went by, and I told myself to stop seeing Simon and to call it quits before things grew much more convoluted. Soon after, though, I returned to his office reviewing documentation and spoke as though nothing had happened, like we were simply two colleagues working through their tasks. Then, as we were finishing up, he gazed at me with the same intensity, as though he could see right through all the walls. I would post, "Are we going to act as though this solely relates to business?" he asked, his voice low and nearly hostile. I couldn't find a response for him. Rather, I sensed a draw more intense than before, and we were entangled in each other once more before I knew it. Every logical component of my brain was yelling to stop, to back off and leave. I could not, though. I let myself be carried off in that mood. That surge drove everything else into the background to vanish. We then took our seats silently. Most likely, both of us were understanding we had entered territory neither of us could return from. Simon broke the silence at last, expressing his knowledge that this could not last. Though he didn't want to stop, it was an imminent danger. And the reality was, that day I left his office neither. I experienced this unusual mix of exhilaration and fear. I was living in two universes, really. The one with my family, my husband and son, and the one with Simon, where I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. And I didn't know how to reconcile them. That evening, I attempted to shrug off everything and tried to be normal at home. I made dinner. I helped Ethan with his homework and performed all the typical mommy things, but I couldn't get Simon out of my brain. I kept wondering about the next time I would see him and about how I would feel that surge all over once more. And more than anything, that terrified me. Actually, I was in far deeper than I would have cared to tell you. And even if I told myself I could stop anytime, I knew that wasn't accurate. That day in Simon's office then, things simply got messy. Trying to keep things together at home while slipping around with Simon whenever I could, it seemed like I was juggling on the brink of this knife. Though every time I considered stopping it, I would feel that tug once more. I knew it was bad. I became dependent on this secret. The surge of being with someone who seemed to really want me around. But hiding was getting more difficult. Thomas was first too preoccupied with his own affairs to really notice when I would come home late or look a little more absent-minded. But lately, he has been asking me whether I was indeed working late, or why I seemed so disconnected. Nothing hostile, only tiny slights that let me feel like he was catching on. Like he was gauging if I would confess anything. He was trying the waters. I aimed to brush it off. Act laid back, although I suppose I wasn't as polished as I had hoped. One Friday, following a long lunch with Simon that ran far over, I arrived home to find Thomas already there. He was simply lounging on the couch, not as normally surfing through his phone, just seated there waiting for me. One could not easily discern his expression. However, it wasn't great. I could tell that really well. Though I didn't know what yet, I felt my gut twist like something was wrong. Hoping he would simply leave it at that, I tried to dismiss it as, "Hey, you're home early and went to put my stuff down." But he failed. "We have to talk," he murmured, his voice serene in a way that seemed to exacerbate everything. Though my heart was hammering like crazy, I sat down on the couch, attempting to keep my face blank. I wanted nothing to be given away, not wanting to presume he knew. Perhaps he simply wanted to discuss the everyday concerns, such as our sons or job stress. But something about his demeanor said otherwise. "Where did you find yourself today?" Looking straight at me as though he were challenging me to lie, he asked, and I knew then as well. He realized. Though I attempted to keep my voice steady, I felt my face get red. I complained about how false I sounded, then I was at work as usual. His gaze stayed not far from mine. "In fact, because I swung around lunch by your office. Thought we may have a quick snack, but they informed me you had left already. Hence, where were you?" My brain became blank. That surprised me not too much. Thomas showed up at my workplace. That hardly matched him at all. That had never been done before, just crumbling before I could even voice them out loud. I could feel the walls closing and every conceivable explanation I could think of. Though I attempted to be cool, my voice came out wavering. I headed to see a customer. It was a last-minute endeavor, nothing large. Though his countenance did not soften at all, Thomas nodded as though he were thinking about it. Leeching back on the couch, he crossed his arms, still observing me. "Funny, since I watched you with him." My heart froze. He observed us. I had no idea of his viewing capacity. I wasn't sure whether he had followed us or merely happened to run across. Still, it didn't matter. He understood. There was no way to talk my way out of it. I simply sat there, not sure what to say. Every word that sprang to me seemed to be somehow aggravating things. Thomas shook his head and let out a long, tremorous sigh. "Long how?" His voice, no more than a whisper, asked. Though I wanted to lie, to say it was just once or twice that it meant nothing, I couldn't bring myself to do it. "A few months later," I said, feeling the weight of those words drop into the room like an explosive had just gone off. He didn't say anything straight away. He just sat there staring at me as though he were trying to see something in my face that would make sense. I could see his eyes reflecting damage. This kind of suffering was far greater than any anger he could have aimed at me. And that made looking at him considerably more difficult. He spoke at last. The reason is that though it seemed like a straightforward inquiry, I had no idea how to respond. How can one describe anything like that? How do you let your husband know he made you invisible? You would risk everything to be seen, driven by such an extreme need for attention. I'm not clear," stammered, aware of how pitiful that sounded. Maybe I felt isolated, like you were not particularly present anymore, like I was simply another component of the daily grind, to mark off from the list. He burst out in a sour laugh. "I work, hence this is my fault. Because I aim to provide for us a life free from financial or stability concerns." Shaking my head, I felt the guilt mounting. Not exactly. "You are not at fault. I know I screwed up. I'm not sure exactly." Rising from the couch, he paced back and forth with hands on his head, as though he were attempting to physically hold himself together. I felt as though we were good. Though we had problems, I thought we would work through them. "Never did I imagine you would." He stopped himself, unable even to articulate the words. Like all the minor decisions I had made, I could sense things falling apart. Those years I had neglected, that voice in my head urging me to stop, had finally returned to torment me. I trusted you, he whispered softly, nearly to himself. I thought of us as partners. Hearing him say that stung on a level I cannot even articulate. I wanted to get in touch to offer something that would make all go away. Still, I understood it wouldn't matter. I had broken something not amenable to words to repair. Is it out? Looking at me once more, he inquired, and this time I could see the simmering wrath under surface level. Surely. I said right away, since I knew it had to be, even if I had been fooling myself previously, and part of me had clung to the notion of Simon as some kind of escape. I could tell it was done. It was necessary. Thomas nodded, saying nothing at all, presumably just processing. The quiet between us felt weighty, as though a million things we both wanted to say, but neither of us knew where to start. At last he just stared at me, his expression a mix of melancholy and something else I couldn't quite identify. You even want to solve this? He inquired. And there was a fragility in his voice that brought me great emotional pain once more. Correct. Whispering, I could hardly get the word out. I am not ready to lose you. Still comma. His expression suggested it was not that straightforward. Perhaps never would be as well. I broke something between us, and I wasn't sure whether there was any going back from it. There was nothing else he said. He merely nodded, nearly as done as he was. Even if they were the last things he wanted to hear, like he had at last acquired the answers he needed. Then he left the room without saying another word, leaving me there by myself with my mess. Laying in bed that evening, I gazed at the ceiling and pondered how I would let things go, and whether there was anything left to save following our last conversation. Things descended from terrible to worse. Thomas was not only yearning for time away. He wanted me outside our house. He claimed he found it intolerable to look at me anymore, that it was finished for good, and that he had begun the divorce proceedings already. The worst thing was that he wanted a divorce, though. It was the state he agreed upon in return for silence. Thomas declared he would fight for Ethan's complete custody. Looking dead in the eye, he warned he would tell Ethan about my affair should I object to giving up my rights. Make sure our son developed knowing just how I had betrayed his father. Hearing him say that, knowing how serious he was, terrified me more than anything. I could not afford to gamble. Knowing I had screwed this terribly, I couldn't allow Ethan to grow up despising me. I so agreed. Signing the paperwork, I gave Thomas full custody of the house and my life. He hardly gave me an opportunity to adequately explain things to Ethan. He grabbed everything, and he called my sister Olivia just as I felt things couldn't get much worse. Though I'm not sure if he had this in mind or if she offered herself. The minute she arrived, it was obvious she had sided with him. Olivia was not restrained. She turned to me as though I were a stranger, like she knew not at all me. She referred to me as selfish. She said I didn't deserve to be in Ethan's life and had destroyed my family, wounded everyone. She seemed to have a ready-made speech, like she had been waiting for me to unload. And the fact was, I could not even dispute. I simply stood there, absorbing it, feeling progressively smaller with every syllable. She turned to Thomas when she had done, and asked him whether there was anything she might do to assist. It dawned on me at that. Olivia would be here forever. She was not only helping him, she intended to live with Ethan and be in his life, perhaps even occupying the space I would have left behind. I couldn't make sense of it. I had a family 1 minute and was on the outside staring in the next. That evening, I departed. Olivia returned. She moved in to assist Ethan and picked up where I had stumbled. It seemed weird, as though I was being deleted from my own life. On my side, I had no sister, no son, and no husband. Nothing at all. Things collapsed quickly following the divorce. I reasoned perhaps Simon would be there for me, but he disappeared as soon as he realized I was no longer married. He would not send back my texts, barely answered my calls, and I began to get this gut sense that he was seeing others. Though at first I didn't want to believe it, the truth was not far off. The entire time he had been with 2 other women, I was only another flirting friend, something to keep his mind occupied. So I was divorced, alone, now dumped by the man I had risked all for. I thought of myself as a fool, like I would have thrown away my life for fiction. Funny, too. Simon made me visible, and I used to think of that. That he had given me something unavailable at home. Ultimately, though, he would have only exploited me and thrown me aside when I became inconvenient once more. And then arrived the employment. Thomas did not only bring Ethan into the house, he followed my career as well. He somehow let my company know about the affair and about my unethical behavior with a customer. They did almost worse, not fired me. They essentially pushed me into this little, meaningless post, slashed my pay, and removed my primary duties. They said I was damaging the company's name and that I was lucky not to have to leave completely. So there I was. No husband, no son, no real career. I couldn't believe how rapidly everything had fallen apart. I kept promising myself I'd find a way to make things right, that I'd pick up the pieces somehow. But every time I attempted, something else would knock me down. Thomas agreed to let me see Ethan, but only outside the house, in a park or a coffee shop. Every time we'd meet up, I attempted to put on a happy face for Ethan and make him feel like everything was normal. But then I'd have to say goodbye. Watch him stroll back to the life I used to have. And it had hit me all over again. It seemed like I was just a visitor in his life, not his mom. Then one day, Ethan dropped a grenade that I wasn't prepared for. He told me all nonchalant, like it was typical that he'd seen Olivia come out of his dad's room late at night. I froze, not really sure what to say. I didn't want to reveal how much it hurt. I didn't want to make Ethan feel strange, but inside I was crushed. My own sister is sleeping with my ex-husband, living in the house I used to call home. A few weeks later, I got an email from Thomas. They were announcing their engagement. He was marrying Olivia, my sister. I just sat there staring at the screen, feeling everything I'd fought to cling on slip through my fingers. I'd lost my spouse, my son, my sister, and my job. Every single component of the life I'd established was gone, taken over by folks who had no trouble moving on without me. And the worst part? I had no one to blame except myself. This was the disaster I'd produced. The implications I'd never considered would come back to haunt me. Karma hit me like a freight train, and I couldn't pretend I didn't deserve it. I'd thrown away everything that mattered for a fling, for a dumb, selfish error that wasn't worth a fraction of what I'd lost. Now I'm simply trying to survive, trying to pick up what little is left of my life. I keep telling myself there has to be some way forward, some way to put things right again. But honestly, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if I'll ever get back what I threw away. All I know is that I've got to keep going, one day at a time. Story 4. All right, thus here is the sequence of events. Look at this. I work my butt off in tech and am 28. Living modestly and splitting a flat with 2 roommates helps one conserve every dollar. Although they have never been financially steady either, I would not describe my parents as destitute. Over the years, my folks have experienced their fair share of financial hardships. My dad particularly always changes occupations, occasionally laid off in search of other means of income. He occasionally experimented with other fields. If you know what I mean, they have always been on the brink of barely surviving. Growing up, my sister and I had somewhat different treatment. She is 3 years younger than him, but man, she has always been the favorite. She could never truly do any wrong, so they allowed her to act any way she desired. She left high school without intending to attend college, essentially floated about taking odd jobs here and there and dropped out. I was the conscientious one meanwhile. Perry, well, she wasn't going to. Hence, my parents always had high hopes for me and constantly hinted that I had to be the one to make it. They so spread their savings thinly and borrowed money to help me through tech school. They were counting on me to pull through and made it abundantly evident that this was my chance to make something of myself. They were direct about how they gave up for me, about how they might have spent that money on themselves or set it for retirement. But rather, they made investments in my future. Actually, back then, I saw nothing illegal about it. Indeed, they are acting in line with what any parent would have done, right? They wanted me to be successful. I so lowered my head and worked hard, believing one day I would pay them back and everything would be good. I started a decent job following tech school. Though it wasn't much, it was enough to start paying back some of the college loans and saving, therefore relieving some of the burden. I would periodically forward them some money. Not too much since I was still organizing my life, enough to assist though. Dad would remind me of the great sacrifices they had made every time I sent something. suggesting that yet more they were due. This was primarily via subdued remarks like, "Don't forget who brought you here or where you came from." Though real subtle, I understood the message. Then, one evening, I'm back home paying a few days' visit. We are seated around the dinner table simply chatting. This is the first time I've been able to take some actual time off. Dad suddenly brings up their still renting situation and the difficulty of not having a place to call their own. He discusses the rent increases, the noisy neighbors, and the exhausting nature of moving every few years when the lease expires. Then he squarely stares at me and adds, "We're just wondering when we can stop living on rent and finally settle down, you know?" Though I kind of dismiss it as him only venting, he goes, "You ought to consider purchasing us a house, son. Right now, you are doing great. To get you here, we have done our share." Halfway through my lunch, I'm seated there, staring at him like, wait, what exactly? They struck me as dead serious. My mother interrupts, all encouraging, and says it would truly mean the world to us. A place we might define personally. Only you can bring that dream to pass. I felt imprisoned at that instant. I had no idea what to say while they were right there fixated on me. They did pay for my schooling and help me growing up on one hand, but they also bought a whole house for me. My career is only getting started. And here they were, speaking like I should already have enough saved to cover top-notch living expenses plus a house purchase price. Saying, "Dad, I'm hardly paying rent myself." I tried to brush it off. "Not even for you folks, but only for me. I cannot afford a house." They dismissed it, though, with a smirk and a knowing glance, as if they thought I would sort it out, finally. They kept dropping hints over the next several months. Every phone conversation, every time I visited, there would be a comment like, "It would be so lovely to settle down somewhere," or "All we want is a little place, nothing large." They would also follow up with the customary reminders on sacrifices, how they had to drain their money from my university, how much they went without, and how they lacked choice. Not even able to dispute with them. Everything they said was accurate. They did make sacrifices and had invested everything in my future. But it began to feel as though they were also depriving me of options, like they were propelling me toward a corner. Their instrument was guilt, and they used it delicately. I eventually yielded. Years of saving and cutting back helped me accumulate enough for a down payment. I wanted to do it for them, partially because I felt I owed them, and also because I thought it would at last bring all the guilt trips to a stop. I so got them a house. Nothing crazy, simply a small space in a peaceful neighborhood. However, it was theirs. I thought, this is a fantastic thing, even if I still lived in an apartment. At last, they will be pleased. Perhaps today, they will let me live my life. They were delighted for the first several months. Every contact I received from them focused on how wonderful the house was, how cozy they felt, and how happy they were about at last having a place to call home. They showed it to their relatives and friends, and for once, it felt as though the continual strain was released. They had their house, and at last I was free to start concentrating on my own objectives. Though I had assumed it would cause distance, it didn't. The house came up just more. Mom would note how they were creating a real home and all the little improvements they wanted, suggesting that it would be fantastic if I could assist with those expenses too. Dad would remind me of the mortgage payments and emphasize how every one of us is helping to bring this about. Every time I would phone, there seemed to be something fresh. They would want to talk about the house. Still, I maintained paying the mortgage and sent extra money whenever I could to close it off earlier. Though my life seemed to be work, save, and repeat, it felt as though I was striving for something positive. I had, after all, brought their fantasy to pass. That seemed to be what counted. But I would get that sinking sensation every time I checked my personal savings. I was still barely surviving, giving all these sacrifices for a place I could not even dwell in, while they lounged pleasantly in what ought to be our achievement. Now that my parents owned the house, I reasoned that things would finally cool. I assumed they would retreat somewhat. I mean, I'd done something rather significant for them, but the entire favorite child thing with my sister Perry kept resurfacing, and it seemed like the more I volunteered, the more they came depending on me. Though I told myself it was nothing, I was beginning to feel more like a wallet than a son. Though everyone else save my parents can clearly see, Perry has always been treated differently. She grew up never under any expectations. She left high school early, engaged in activities that didn't really fit her, and sort of wandered from job to job. From their perspective, though, she was only discovering her alternatives or finding herself. They constantly managed to capture her decisions in some forgiving light. I was advised to keep focused, work hard, and generally build something out of myself so I could help the family. It was really evident from my high school years who they were betting on. About my grades, professional path, and whatever move I made, I got drilled. Perry could bring home FS on her report card, and Mom would explain to her that not everyone is suited for school. She could do nothing wrong. I was the one supposed to set the standard. They considered me their insurance, the one who would go out to see to it everyone was looked after. Perry received everything handed to her. Hence, she was like the family pet, except here I am paying for the house while they treat it as though it were hers too. At first, I paid hardly any thought to it. Technically, it was their residence. Hence, if she wanted to visit or stay for a weekend, it was not really my concern. Then, though, I would get strange remarks from my parents regarding how Perry truly loved the new location, or about how she had been spending days at a stretch. They even began discussing how fantastic it would be if she moved in close by. That little clue continued showing up every time I visited or gave a call. Every single interaction with them began to resemble some variant of "it's so nice for Perry to have stability nearby. Perhaps she could live here until she works things out." They would say it casually, as though it were not really significant, just something to consider. But I'd worked my ass off to get that house for them, not to pay for a place Perry could crash whenever she felt like it. A few months in, I came to see her little visits were more than just visits. She was living almost exactly there. One day, I questioned Mom straightforward since I wanted to avoid drawing snap decisions. She responded vaguely, something like, "Oh well, she's just here looking after things around the house." Aiding with what, though? Perry was there, lounging about as if she owned the house every time I visited. One weekend, I made the unannounced visit decision. I wanted to see for myself what was actually going on. Hence, I hadn't told them I was coming. When I arrived there, nobody else opens the door. Not my folks. That is Perry. Looking very at ease, she is in pajamas, like this was her residence. She asked, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Clearly startled to see me. As though I were the one invading. Just standing there a little surprised, I recall trying to understand why she was acting like she had been for weeks. When I get in, her stuff is all over the house. Around were clothes, bags, and cosmetics. She had moved in almost exactly, not asking about it. "Where are Mom and Dad?" I ask her. She shrugs, saying they're out shopping or something and won't be back for some time. I sit down trying to seem cool, but inwardly, I'm raging. We sit in this uncomfortable silence for a few minutes, and I simply can't stand it anymore. I travel. "Are you thus briefly staying here?" She shrugs once again, saying, "Well, it's a good location. Mom and Dad are not bothered about me staying around here." I was ready to correct her. Speak something like this. Yes, maybe I mind, but I knew that would blow out into something more. So I nodded, biting my tongue, trying not to lose it. Just there. Following the return of my parents, I mentioned it informally, saying something like, "Hey, I didn't know Perry was staying here." They simply laughed it off, stating she needed a temporary somewhere to stay since her housemates weren't working things out. That perfectly meant what I knew. She most likely missed her rent payment or was kicked out for not paying her half. Naturally, though, my parents would never say such to me directly. It was simply another innocuous small change in her life. She never thought of anything as hers. We all sat down for supper that evening, and the whole time they continued complimenting her for a roundhouse help. I found it hard to believe. Their behavior suggested that she was some sort of hero just by virtue of her presence. Actually, I am the one paying for the space. Every time I wanted to bring up something connected to the house. They would turn the discussion back to Perry. How great that was for her. How she was at last setting her feet on the ground, and how this was exactly what she needed to start along the correct road. I felt as though I was no longer even in the image. This house they were building was for her. As if my giving up had never happened. That night, I couldn't get rid of this sense of duping. I signed not to be buying Perry a house. Though I bought it for them believing I would be providing protection, it began to feel more like I was funding Perry's new existence. Frustrated, I departed that visit as if I had entered a trap. I had no knowledge of being present. It was getting more and more evident that, with Perry, my parents had a blind spot the size of a house. It was getting difficult to ignore. I felt like I was being taken advantage of. When I visited my folks the following time, they dropped even more explosives on me. They began discussing Perry's seeming calm in the house and how wonderful it would be if she had her own place. Saying, well, she's got to find her own way eventually. I attempted to brush it aside, but they simply stared at me blankly as though I wasn't understanding. And I came to see then that her own space meant different things to them. All right, now here's where things went totally off the tracks after that last visit. When I'd walked in on Perry simply lounging about the house, I believed she would be moving out soon, or at least help out if she was planned to remain longer. Like we all do when we're going through anything. I reasoned perhaps she was just momentarily crashing there. A few weeks later, though, my mother rings me up all laid back and blasts me. Indeed, they had moved out. Yes, you did read correctly. Perry had moved in full-time when my parents left the house I bought for them. I sat there trying to sort it while phone in hand. What I was hearing stunned me. I mean, I bought that house especially for my parents, believing it would provide the stability and peace of mind they so richly deserve. And suddenly, they turned around and handed it to Perry. Not heads up, not a discussion. Only a friendly announcement here. Like I would not find difficult with it. Trying to keep my voice steady, I asked, "Why would you want to leave? You and Dad were meant to live in this house, not Perry." My mother simply laughed, dismissingly writing it off as not really important. "Oh, honey, we wanted a fresh start. Perry also needs the house more than we do right now." She trying to organize her life, and having a consistent place to live will be very beneficial to her. She stated it rather as a matter of fact, like it was the most sensible approach available. She said she is trying to organize her life. Like that explained everything. She needs consistency, particularly if she will eventually start a family. Stunned, I was sitting there trying to process what she had just said. Balance. What about the stability I had been aiming for? What about all the things I would have given up to ensure my parents lived in a decent house? And suddenly, too late. Perry was merely taking over. They had not even bothered to find out whether I would be comfortable with it. At last, I asked them straightforward, "Are you then saying Perry is now living full-time, and with regard to the mortgage? Who bears the cost of that?" My mother's voice changed to sound almost defensive, as though I were accusing her of something. "You are doing well for yourself now, honey, not least of which is that you should not find it too significant to keep paying a little bit more. Apart from that, she is family. That was right there. The line is once more, you're doing great." As though all the sacrifices I had made and my diligence meant they had free access to whatever I had created for myself. Though I tried to cool off, it felt like a slap in the face. "This is not what we agreed upon," Mom said. "Not so Perry could live rent-free while I pay the bills. I bought that house for you and Dad." She sighed, sounding annoyed as though I were the one acting irrationally. "We assumed you would get it. She is struggling and has fewer possibilities than you do. You've always been the responsible one, and we're just asking you to help a little longer." At that point, I was barely holding it together. Help a little longer. "Mom, I'm paying for the entire thing. It's not a little help. I've been paying extra every month to get this paid off faster, thinking it was for your stability. Now you're telling me you just handed it over to Perry without even asking me?" My dad chimed in, then attempting to sound cool and rational, but he came off more patronizing than anything. "Son, we didn't realize it'd be such a huge problem. We know you're financially stable, and Perry could really use this. It's just till she gets back on her feet." "Gets back on her feet," I remarked, my voice rising despite attempting to keep it in check. "She's been getting back on her feet her entire life. When does it cease being my obligation to repair everything for her?" They just sat there looking at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. Finally, my mom responded, "Well, maybe we shouldn't have anticipated you'd be so willing to help your own family. the way she phrased it, like I was the evil guy, just hit me hard. It was like no matter what I did, they'd always find a way to turn it on me. I got up to go saying, hey, this needs to change. Either she pays her portion or you guys do. But I'm not only paying for Perry to live free in the house, I am giving everything up for. They said nothing, simply stared at one another, clearly dissatisfied in me, as though I were somehow letting them down. I was more annoyed and deceived than I had ever been driving home. They had done this, blindsiding me with a choice that fundamentally changed my life. Then they had the arrogance to make me feel bad for not wanting to go along. It felt like all my effort, everything I had done for them, had no bearing. Thinking maybe I was overreacting, that maybe I was being selfish for demanding a little say in how my money was being spent, I tried to cool off back at my house. But the more I considered it, the more it struck me that I wasn't entirely unreasonable. Who really hands over a residence someone else is paying for without first consulting them? Which type of parents engage in this? And what sort of sister just moves in without volunteering to help out, without even thinking through perhaps unfairness? I thought of myself as at a junction. What was next if I stayed with this? Just because I was doing well, would I be expected to pay for every little item they wanted to give Perry? Would I always be the backup scheme? The one they could count on any time they needed money? I considered all the years I had labored to reach here and all the sacrifices I had made. I had lived my life attempting to bring them pride, ascending so I could provide them with a better existence. And now, having done it, I felt as though I was only a tool for them, not a son with aspirations of his own, but only a wallet. Also Perry. She lacked even the slightest thankfulness. It was simply expected of me to intervene and correct things for her whenever she needed it. As I considered it, I came to see something had to change. This was never going to stop. I couldn't keep paying for everything without imposing some limits. Should they consider me as their financial safety net, they would never stop consuming. I also never could live my own life. I so decided that, even if it might damage them, I had to create some strict limitations. Not even if they lacked understanding. Ultimately, I had spent too much time giving everything up for a family who considered my accomplishment as theirs to spend. And I had more dignity than that. That last call made it abundantly evident that I had to make some difficult choices. The whole thing had spiraled out of hand. Without some strict limitations, they would keep draining me until I had nothing left. My parents changed my house into Perry's, moved out without saying anything, and had the arrogance to utilize my extra money to finance their rent. Their lack of any problems with any of it indicated they would keep on unless I set ground rules. I considered it over a few days. I wanted to approach this coolly, not merely arrive armed. It was a straightforward plan. I would tell them I wasn't going to keep sending extra money, and if Perry wanted to live there, she had to start making mortgage payments or move out. Time was for some actual limits. I thus told my parents we needed to have a face-to-face conversation. Though they were not happy, they consented, and I went to their new residence. When I arrived, the tension was strong. They clearly understood what this was about. We sat down, and I didn't waste any time straightforwardly reaching the point. Look, I started maintaining the calmest voice I could. The bank told me the extra money I have been sending hasn't gone toward the mortgage. Being kept in the dark about where my money is going bothers me. Try to dismiss it, Dad said. Not a big deal at all. Since we moved out of Perry, we needed the additional to pay rent. You're doing fantastic. We assumed you wouldn't be interested in it. You are doing great. Line again? Hearing it made me rather ill. They utilized it every time. They looked to me for something. Like the fact that I had worked hard somehow, it became my responsibility to resolve all their issues. I inhaled deeply and said, "But Dad, I paid for this house for you, not for Perry. And the money was meant to pay off the mortgage more quickly, not cover second place for you. I cannot keep on like this." My mother looked at me disappointedly, the kind she had honed over years. "Honey, Perry is in need of consistency. She doesn't have the same chance as you do. We assumed you would be interested in helping your sister." I became rather annoyed and could feel my tolerance running thin. "Mom, I am already lending assistance. I sold the house. I even sent more as I have been paying the mortgage. Perry, though, is an adult. She has to help if she intends to live there. Not fair to me is this." Dad shook his head, clearly irritated. "You are egotistical. We have done for you quite a bit. Surely it's time you returned a small gift to the family." Though I felt my rage growing, I controlled it. "I am returning. I have been providing more than plenty. I have rights, though, to impose boundaries. Right now, the limit is that I am only paying the minimal mortgage going forward. Perry either has to find somewhere else to live or pitch in if she stays there." Both of them looked at me, obviously dissatisfied, but I didn't back off. I knew precisely what I wanted to say after practicing this in my thoughts so many times. I wouldn't let guilt force me into caving. I added, "Not about not caring. It comes down to justice. I deserve some regard, as I worked hard to get here. Though I'm glad to help you people, I find this unacceptable." Mom's side tried one final time. "We assumed you would be understanding. Family watches out for one another. Family also values one another." I answered, more determined than ever. "Though I have done all I can to help you, I have to draw the line someplace. I have to give my own life some attention as well. Perry has to help if she wants to stay. If not, I'll figure something else out with the house." There was a long, awkward quiet. I could see they didn't know how to react. They were not used to my talking like this. At last, my dad murmured, "We'll talk to Perry." He obviously wasn't thrilled, but he knew this time I was not backing down. I left both relieved and exhausted. I had, for once, spoken up for myself without feeling bad about it. At that time, I didn't care. I had no idea what they do or what Perry would say. It was time they began to appreciate that I had done more than my share. I didn't hear from them during the next few days. Not one call or one message, just silence. I started to wonder whether I had gone too far, but I knew I had done the correct thing every time I went back over the chat. Years of bending over backward were finally time to put my own needs first. One afternoon, then, my mother phoned. Her voice was quiet, somewhat resigned. She informed me they spoke with Perry, and she agreed to start making mortgage payments. Just little, but it was something. She sounded let down, as though she still couldn't believe I had actually requested it. I didn't let that disturb me, though. "That's excellent to hear," I said, brief as it is. I didn't want to pull this out or start another guilt trip session. For once, they had really honored a limit I had imposed. Hanging there, I had an unusual spectrum of feelings. Though unhappy as well, I felt relieved. Having to fight with my own parents to convince them to value what I'd worked so hard for never seemed like it would come to pass. But I knew it had to happen if I didn't start to defend myself now. My life would be this permanently. Giving often. Always expected to fix everyone else's mistakes. In the next few weeks, things were slower. They pushed less, and I wasn't informed of any more abrupt changes. For once, I felt as though I was really living my life for myself, not only as a backup for everyone else. I wouldn't say everything is fixed, though at least now I have set a line. I know they still rely on me as the responsible one, and I would not hesitate to remind them of where that line resides should they cross it. I arrived here years ago and am not returning. I realized it was time to leave that last chat. I made rules and tried everything logical with them, including making a concession to maintain equity. Nevertheless, it always turned out the same regardless of what I did. Not as their kid with their own life and aspirations, but rather as their safety net, I was seen. I thus decided what I ought to have done long ago. I ceased making the mortgage payments. I came ready for the aftermath. The call started practically right away. My mom called every day, perhaps several times a day at first, leaving these lengthy, winded voicemails on family responsibilities and their disappointment of me. She would remind me of all the things they had done for me growing up, thereby implying that I was some self-serving jerk who had dropped his family. Then my dad started to participate. His voicemails were more annoyed and more precise. "We raised you to support your family," he would remark. "We assumed you would always be by our side." To be honest, though, I felt numb about it. I felt nothing at last, not guilty. They would have seized advantage of anything I could have given them. Now this was not my concern. They ran out of means to get to me finally, after I kept ignoring their calls. Still, that had no effect on them. They began phoning from varying numbers, occasionally even borrowing friends' cell phones to attempt to surprise me. Sure enough, it would be another voicemail from my mom, droning on about how family doesn't desert one another, attempting to guilt-trip me right back into covering the mortgage. I would see an unfamiliar number flash up and hesitate just in case it was urgent. But this time I was not having it. Every number I could identify was blocked. When fresh ones surfaced, I blocked those two as well. Realizing that for them this was normal was what really got to me the most. Family meant I would give without question nonstop. They never considered that I may have dreams of my own, a life. With no one covering the mortgage, they saw me as nothing except a bank account with a voice on the other end of the line. Things went fast. The bank owned the house a few months later, and shortly after it was put on auction. Though there was a bit of sting involved, I had been expecting it. This was the house I meant to have given my parents, the house I had given up so much for. Ultimately, though, it wasn't truly my loss. They concluded Perry was entitled to it, and I stopped wasting money in a location I had no say over. I was having enough. Perry and her husband had to leave the house sold since they lacked means of payment for it personally. Perry too began making calls, but by then I had already blocked her phone. Her sob story made me want nothing. Was not interested in learning about how unjust it was for me to be denying her stability. She had been given every chance to volunteer, to at least share some accountability. She had not done any of it, though, and I was not going to pay attention to her lament about it. Here now. Then arrived the guilt-ridden notes from my parents. They continued even after the home was demolished. Calling me unappreciative and selfish, they tried to make me feel as though I had betrayed them. They said things like, "We never believed you would just walk away from family." To me, though, it seemed as though I had done nothing except provide for my family at the price of my own life. All they saw was that the money had stopped coming. That was sufficient to make me the villain in their narrative. They didn't give a damn about my buying a house for them with money I could have used for myself, or about years I had sacrificed my own objectives to help them. They were not interested in my merely attempting to make a reasonable decision for them. I would turn into the bad person. The moment I got to my feet, defending myself. My parents ended up renting a smaller apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, last I heard. Perry had to at last come up with a fresh strategy for herself since they couldn't afford to maintain the way of life they had known. Based on what I know, my parents have had to cut back. They are handling. Furthermore, Perry. Her regular handouts are no longer. She is on her own for what seems like her first time in life. Though I might have felt guilty about it previously, today I view it differently. She called for this wake-up alert. Perhaps now she will see she has to put in her own effort without me as a fallback. For me, at last I acquired my own apartment. Not elegant at all. One modest flat I pay for on my own terms. Knowing that this is my space and that I'm not always working solely to support someone else's life lends a sort of tranquility to me. At last, I can begin to save for a future just for me. One objective I'm really enthusiastic about is eventually owning my own house, one that is really mine. Looking back, it's crazy how many years it took for me to see the truth. I reminded myself I was acting in line with right behavior. That family meant giving all you possessed. But somewhere along the road, family started to be a means of consumption without considering the cost. Though it's unpleasant, I needed this insight. I represented their wallet, not only their child, and even if that hurt, it has guided me toward the line I ought to have drawn years ago. Given hindsight's 20/20ths, I suppose they're correct. If I had known how things would turn out, I might have behaved differently. However, perhaps at the same time, this was the only means I could perceive the truth. All those years of guilt and all those offerings. Now I realize it was more about control than love. They did not desire a boy who was content and reliable. They yearned for someone who looked after them unquestioningly. I'm not sure whether they will ever accept what's happened. I am, for all I know, the selfish son who left his family when they most needed him. Really, though, I'm good with that. They are free to believe whatever narrative helps them feel better and think any way they want. Ultimately, though, I know that by leaving, I did the right thing. I am now at last free to concentrate on me. I have plans and am saving. creating a life free from depending on first-time bailing others out for dot. My future seems like mine, and I can't even explain how wonderful it feels to know that the things I labor for will really benefit my own life, not merely vanish into someone else's need. Though it took a long time to get here, I have no regrets. Actually, I'm glad. I had the will to change after at last I realized the reality. Family should reflect love and respect, rather than responsibility and sacrifice. And now I'm finally